So today I plan to present a number of different topics. First are the management practices that benefit soil health or soil quality. Talk about potential benefits of cover crops. Specifically talk about cover crop effects on nitrogen, soil organic matter, temperature, aggregate stability, microbial activity. Really focus on the following crop yield and crop protein, since that's what affects your bottom line. And also talk about economics. Finally, consider some management options with cover crops. So starting with some real basics, thinking about soil. So soil is composed of basically 4 different items. The mineral component, which is the component we think about when we see soil, basically the sand, silt, and clay portion. The air, which represents generally about 1/4 of soil. Water, which hopefully represents 1/4. And then the smallest fraction in soil would be the soil organic matter. In Montana, that's generally around 2 to 3%. 5%, as I have up here on the pie chart, would be really ideal. And even though it's the smallest fraction, I would argue that it's probably the most important part of soil. Some practices that benefit soil and build soil organic matter would be things like minimizing disturbance, keeping the soil surface covered, using good nutrient management practices, keeping a living root in the soil, and increasing the diversity of your plant community. When I think about perennial pasture or forage production, which about half of you raised your hand when I asked if you're in that type of system, I think about that's a very minimal disturbance system. You're not tilling the soil. You're keeping the soil surface covered. You're keeping a living root in the soil. You may or may not have a diverse system. For example, if you're straight alfalfa or say straight orchard grass. But if you have a mixed alfalfa grass system, you have a little more diversity. So in general, when I think about soil quality, I would say that perennial systems produce higher soil quality than annual systems, again, because they keep a living root in the system. There's no disturbance. The plant is growing essentially for as long as it possibly can, whereas in an annual system, a plant may only be growing for, say, 5 months out of a 2-year period, say a wheat fallow system. So there's a lot more time for that soil to break down, that soil organic matter to break down and release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So thinking about, say, a new seeding of a forage or in a fallow system, the best way to minimize disturbance would be some sort of no-till system, which would minimize disturbance. Recropping instead of fallow should also produce more soil organic matter, more plant life in the soil in, say, a 2 or 3 year period than in a crop fallow system. So in a recrop system, we have more living roots in the soil. We keep the soil surface covered more than, say, in a crop fallow system. So the question would be, say, at a new seeding time in a forage or in a summer fallow system, would those be good places for a cover crop to be grown or not? And that's what I'm going to discuss for the rest of it. So I want to start with research going back to 1999, which is when my colleague Perry Miller started studying cover crops in Montana. Most of his work until the last 4 years has been on single species cover crops, so things like, say, buckwheat or spring pea, winter pea, lentil. And what he's found is that in general, grain yields and grain protein are higher when he seeded a winter legume instead of a spring legume. He's found that seeding a spring cover crop early, meaning say in April versus May or June or July, produces higher yield. Terminating early, meaning somewhere around, say, first bloom rather than at pod stage, and tilling a cover crop generally produces higher protein versus, say, spring. So you might be saying, well, why? Well, more nitrogen is fixed by winter legumes than spring legumes. seeding and terminating early gives Mother Nature more time to refill that soil profile with water and gives more time for microbes to break down residue, release nitrogen back to the soil for the next crop. And finally, we think that probably tilling the residue into the soil gives microbes a better opportunity again to break down that organic residue. We know there's lots of advantages of no-till over till, but this would be one advantage of tilling over. So looking again at some of Perry's historical research showing the benefits of early termination. This is a graph that shows grain yield in bushels per acre following either a fallow field, which was used as a control, an early terminated pea crop, pea cover crop, or a pea that was allowed to go all the way to grain. So the brown is the grain yield following chem fallow, green following early bloom, and yellow following mature pod. On the left was a research study done at Denton where neither water nor nitrogen was limiting because a disease was limiting. Note there, it didn't matter whether you terminated a cover crop early, terminated late, or had chem fallow, yield was essentially limited by that disease. In the middle, this was in Haber, where water was limiting, like it is in Haber most years. Notice that the yield following chem fallow and following an early bloom terminated cover crop was higher, substantially higher, than when that pea was allowed to go all the way to maturity. And finally, on the far right at Amsterdam, there nitrogen was limiting and water was not limiting. Notice there that terminating that pea cover crop at early bloom actually produced the highest yield. Probably you got a lot more nitrogen in the soil, you used less water than, say, at pod, and you had more time for nitrogen. So I'd say in general, in, say, the Lewis and Clark County area, we probably have water limitation except on irrigated systems. So we're probably most similar there to the Haber condition. Moving on to another study, this was done in Amsterdam, Montana, on the western side of Gallatin County. Here we had 3 different crop treatments. So we had a spring pea manure, by manure I mean cover crop, spring lentil manure, and then we had a fallow control. We also had 2 tillage treatments, both no-till and tillage. We terminated all our green manures at the first sign of bloom. We grew spring wheat across this entire study at 4 different nitrogen rates, and this is in a 14-inch precipitation. These first 2 graphs show grain yield in bushels per acre with the nitrogen rate across the horizontal axis. The black circles are grain yield of wheat following pea. The open circles are wheat following lentil, and the stars there are the fallow control. But notice at the low nitrogen rate for the no-till system that the pea looks like it might have outcompeted the other 2 systems, fallow and lentil. But as nitrogen rate increased, there was really no advantage of any of the cover crops over fallow, but on the other hand, there wasn't really a disadvantage. On the right, when we tilled those cover crops in, there was higher yield following lentil and pea compared to fallow, at least at low nitrogen rates. Moving on to grain protein, here the results were a little more consistent between no-till and till, where in every case, grain grown after pea produced about 1 point higher protein than grown after either lentil or fallow. Pea fixes quite a bit more nitrogen than lentil, and we think that's why we saw this response. So some take-home messages there is that early terminated spring cover crop did not hurt wheat yield or protein, at least at this site in these years. You can tell from the yields that these were relatively moist years in Amsterdam. We found that pea cover crop only increased yield at the low end rates when it was tilled. We found that P increased grain yield at all end rates for both no-till and tilled systems. And finally, the lentil cover crop did not benefit yield or protein, and likely the nitrogen contribution was simply too low. Any questions on any of those studies I've shown till now?
When you said, I understand the winter, cover crop, you plant that in winter, fall, winter, but the spring, are you talking about April?
Yeah, so the question was, what do I mean when I say spring? In this particular study, yes, the spring cover crops were seeded in April. So this next study, which was started in 2011 by Perry Miller, my colleague Kathy Zabinski, and myself, focuses on cover crop cocktails. So cocktail is just more than one species, as Susan Tallman mentioned in that video we just watched. And there's a lot of interest in this that's kind of spread from the Dakotas, the western Dakotas, where cover crop cocktails appear to be more beneficial to soil quality and grain yield and protein than single species cover crops. A lot of that's anecdotal, there's not a lot published on it. We wanted to see in a drier rainfall zone here in Montana, would we see benefits of cocktails over single species? So again, we wanted to compare crop and soil responses to fallow, a single species pea cover crop, which essentially is a second control because we feel we know quite a bit about how pea cover crops behave. And then multi-species mixtures ranging from 2 species, 6 species, and 1 8-species mixture. We measured a whole bunch of different parameters in the soil. We measured microbial parameters, biological parameters. We also measured some physical parameters like compaction and aggregate stability, and some chemical parameters like nitrogen and available phosphorus. Like again, Susan said in the video, we wanted to determine the effects of 4 plant functional groups on soil quality and also subsequent yield and protein. And we had 4 different sites for the study, 2 in Gallatin Valley and 2 in the Triangle, 1 in Conrad and 1 in Bethel. So again, this is a little repeat of what Susan showed in the video, but we had nitrogen fixers, fibrous-rooted species, taprooted species, and then brassicas were our 4 major functional. We learned a lot in the first year of the study, which kind of bad news for us was 2012, a very droughty year in almost all of Montana. We learned that early weed control was essential. We let downy brome get away from us up in Conrad. We learned that common vetch was very difficult to kill with glyphosate. Now, that might have been because it was a drought year, but we simply couldn't kill it with just glyphosate. We found that camelina, Italian ryegrass, and lentil were not competitive in mixtures. Even though they grow pretty well as single species, they just could not compete with larger, more robust plants. We found millet, which is a warm season species, to not be competitive in this cool season mix. These mixes were, with millet, were seeded in early May. So we thought that might be late enough to give millet a chance, but it simply was still too cool. And David Weaver, our sawfly specialist, tells us that oat kills wheat stem sawfly. So wheat stem sawfly doesn't know it's laying its egg in oat versus wheat, but once the larvae hatches in there, it ends up dying. So oat could be a great biological control in these cover crop systems. So what did we find? This is in 2013, which was a much wetter year, and we were able to grow about 1.5 tons per acre of cover crop, which is, we felt pretty good. What this graph shows is the 10 different species of cover crops on the horizontal axis, or the 10 different mixtures. So we have P on the far left, then the 8 species full mix. We have the NF, which is nitrogen fixers, FR, the fibrous rooted species, TR, the taprooted species, and BC, the brassicas. And all those M's, those like MNF, that means minus. So what we started with was that 8 species mix, and we took out a functional group. So MNF would mean minus N fixers. MFR would be minus the fibrous root. Our thought was if any of these 6 species mixes performed as well as the 8 species mix, we would know that that functional group that we pulled out didn't really make a difference. That might allow a grower to say save on seed costs. So what we found was that there was only 2 groups that did significantly worse than the average case, and those were the nitrogen fixers and the taprooted, meaning they grew less biomass than the others. Even though it may look like there's some differences there, those were the only 2 significantly lower biomass producers. And there were no significant differences. Again, it looks like there are some, but there was a lot of variability, so we can't say any of these were different than the others. The other thing that these 2 graphs show is what species did better than the others. So, for example, the purple or the lavender color there, that was how much P biomass was in each of these mixtures. So I see quite a bit of purple there. I see even more orange. So the orange were the radishes. Radish was a very good biomass producer for us. And the pink were the oats. So the oats did pretty well too. So I would say those were the 3 species that were most competitive in these mixtures. How about the subsequent year? What happened the next year at Dutton when we grew spring wheat across the entire site at 3 different nitrogen rates? What this shows is spring wheat grain yield on the vertical axis in bushels per acre. And then again, each of the 10 cover crop treatments across the horizontal axis along with fallow on the far left there. If there's a different letter between any of the bars, that means that there was a significant difference between means. So what should really catch your eye is that spring wheat grain yield following fallow produced was the highest grain yield of any of the treatments. The 8 species mix did no better than really any of the other mixes. And the 2 that really stand out are the 2 N-fixing mixes, P only and the N-fixing functional group, which was pea and lentil. So again, we know that water pretty much always limits plant growth in a dry land system in Montana, but we also know that nitrogen generally limits plant growth too. So having an N-fixer in the mix seemed to really increase grain yield. I also wanted to see if there was any relationship between spring wheat grain yield and the previous year cover crop biomass. So here on the horizontal axis, I have cover crop plus weed biomass, and on the vertical axis, I have spring wheat grain yield. What it shows is an inverse relationship, meaning as we grew more biomass, we produced less grain yield, and that's likely because that biomass used a little bit more water. The other thing I've plotted on here is the blue diamonds represent cover crop treatments that had legumes, and the red squares are ones that did not have legumes. And so again, if there were legumes in the mix, grain yield was a little bit higher than that average line, and if there were not, grain yield was a little bit. So, but what about soil health, which was really the focus of our study, a little more than grain yield. So here I have across the top our 4 different sites, Amsterdam, Conrad, Dutton, and Bozeman. And down the left-hand side, I'm going to show a variety of different parameters that we measured. The main comparison that I'm doing here is between the single species P and the 8 species full mix. So if we don't see a difference between a single species and an 8 species mix, there's probably not a lot of differences in between. So we did not find cover crop biomass differences between those 2. Biomass carbon to nitrogen ratio, which gives an indication of how fast a residue might break down. The lower the C to N ratio, the faster it will break down. That was higher at 2 of our sites in the 8 species mix than in the single species mix. Microbial biomass was higher in our cover crop treatments, indicated there by CC than our fallow treatments, but it did not differ between, again, the single species mix and the 8 species mix. Potentially mineralizable nitrogen was fairly mixed between the different sites. Available phosphorus indicated there's Olsen phosphorus was not significant at any of the 4 sites. Temperature was pretty significantly cooler under cover crop than under fallow, which should make sense. We think that should conserve some water because it should slow evaporation. And aggregates, which are generally viewed as a good thing in soil, clumps of soil that allow roots to grow between them and allow water to move down, was not significant between these different cover crop treatments at any of the 4 sites. So that was after 1 rotation. We now are far enough in the study where we have a second rotation. So we grew cover crop in 2012, wheat in 13, cover crop again in 14, came back in early 15, and sampled the soil again at 2 of our sites, Amsterdam and Conrad. There we found that the 6 species mix at Amsterdam did produce more biomass than our 2 species mixes. So that was interesting. We also found that cover crops produce more microbial biomass, more microbial enzymes, which is an indicator of microbial activity, and more PMN, or potentially mineralizable nitrogen, and fallow. That was all at Amsterdam. At Conrad, we didn't find any difference. We also, again, did not find differences between our single species P and our 8 species O. Pretty similar results as after 1 rotation for available phosphorus, temperature, and aggregate stability. So, summarizing all that, after 1 cycle, spring wheat grain yields were higher after P and N fixers than most other mixes. High cover crop biomass correlated with lower spring wheat grain yield, likely because of more water use and more nitrogen use. There were relatively few soil health differences between P and 8 species mixes after 1 cycle, which I would say is not that unexpected. It's taken thousands of years to build our lovely soil that we have, and it's hard to picture that after just 1 year of a cover crop, we could really make a significant. After 2 cycles, we saw no soil health differences between P and 8 species mix, but cover crops did increase microbial activity compared to fallow. So after 2 cycles, we're starting to see a few more differences. Any questions on that cover crop cocktail study? Yes?
I'm just kind of curious, how do you determine microbial activity?
So microbial activity, we measured microbial enzymes, so 5 different enzymes that were all associated with nutrient availability. So there's some phosphorus enzymes and some sulfur and some nitrogen enzymes. And so we do an extraction of the soil, and then we measure these enzymes, and we make the leap a little bit that if there's more enzymes there, there's more microbes that are higher activity. Other questions? Yeah, Brent.
Clay, could you explain the differences, why there was no significant changes at Conrad versus Amsterdam?
So yeah, I didn't get into that, but Amsterdam is a sandy loam soil. Conrad is a clay loam soil. I think that there's a higher potential for changes in a coarse soil, a little lower organic matter to start with, than in a clayier, higher organic matter soil. There's just more potential for change, and that's just a guess of why we saw that. Yeah.
You said benefit of soft bodies for oats and rashes. You kind of said on the oats that they can be used in later eggs and but the rash is also there.
Yeah. So the biggest killer of wheat stem sawfly is a parasitic wasp. And that parasitic wasp, David tells me, needs, in part of its life cycle, a flower. And he thinks the radish in there is a great flower for this parasitic wasp to feed on. Other questions? Okay, so part of that study, that plot study I just showed, also had a field component where we asked 6 growers to split a field into grow a cover crop of their choice, a mixed cover crop on one side, and then have the other side fallow. They then grew wheat or barley across the entire field, and we came in and measured grain yield and protein on both sides of that cover crop fallow boundary. So what did we find? So over here in the green is the grain yield following cover crop, and in the brown is the grain yield following fallow. Notice that in 4 of these 6 cases, I have a little star here, and that means that there's actually a significant difference between the wheat following fallow and following cover crop. So notice in each of those 4 cases, grain yield is higher following fallow than cover crop, and the other 2, there was not a significant difference. When we average across those entire 6 sites, we find that the average yield loss or yield hit for growing a cover crop was 15 bushels per acre. That's substantial. That would be enough to not make me want to try cover crops again. What was interesting is you saw in our work, in our plot studies, the yield hit ranged from essentially 0 to maybe up to about 5 bushels per acre. So this was a lot higher. When we interviewed the growers about when they seeded and when they terminated, turned out that almost all of them terminated quite a bit later than we would recommend, closer to flat pod to full pod, and some almost to seed set, meaning they were about to let their cover crop go to seed and become a potential weed. So we think that they just terminated far too late, didn't conserve very much water, and probably the temptation was, if I grow more biomass, I'll increase my soil health more. But what they did was they ended up taking a pretty serious yield hit the next year. They probably also decreased the amount of stubble they returned to the field in this year. And so I would argue that probably by letting it go that late, probably did not benefit soil health. When we look at grain protein, the results are more mixed, where in 2 of these cases, grain protein was higher following fallow. 1 case, it was higher following the cover crop, and in 3, there was no difference. So it looks like protein is not as affected as much by the cover crop as yield. So some take-home messages there. Spring wheat grain yield was lower after the cover crop than fallow in 4 of 6 of the studies. Protein results were mixed. High water use from late termination was the likely cause of this. So not a very stellar outlook for cover crops in the short term, but what about the long term? I'm going to show results from a study done west of Bozeman in a 16-inch rainfall zone that Perry's had going since 2002. So here we're looking at the long-term effects of no-till pea forage or legume cover crop systems versus fallow systems. Again, a 16-inch rainfall zone, so keep that in mind if you're in, say, more of a 13-inch rainfall zone. Pea forage was grown in 2003, 2005, 2007, and then a pea cover crop was grown in this system in 2009. And we did terminate it later than we recommend for the triangle, again, because we have a little more moisture and we felt we could get away with that. Wheat was planted in even years. 2010 was the wettest of the wheat years, and 2012 was the driest. We grew all the wheat at 2 different N rates, both a full rate, meaning 3 pounds of available N per bushel, and a half rate. And there was no differences in wheat yield following the cover crop compared to following fallow in 2004, 6, 8, and 12, but there was a large benefit of the cover crop in 2010, as I'll show you here. So again, this shows grain yield in bushels per acre on the vertical axis. The grain yield following fallow is in brown. Notice it did about the same as following the green manure at the full N rate, but at the half N rate, the grain yield following green manure was about 15 bushels per acre higher than following fallow. So almost an opposite result of what I've been showing you in these short-term studies, where generally yield is less after the cover crop. Something that really caught my eye was notice that the grain yield is almost identical between the following fallow at the full nitrogen rate and following the green manure of the cover crop at the half N rate. and that was a savings of about 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, very substantial. When we look at soil organic matter in that same study, there was more than just that cover crop and fallow treatment. We also had a tilled fallow treatment over here on the left. We had a wheat system, a pea grown for grain wheat, pea grown for forage followed by wheat, cover crop wheat, and then CRP. And here I plot soil organic matter in tons per acre, and this was work done by my colleague, Rick Engel. He also plots on here the soil organic matter at the beginning of the study. So what it shows is, as you'd probably expect, that both fallow systems decrease soil organic matter compared to the initial, with no-till being better than till. Both recrop systems increase soil organic matter, and the cover crop systems just maintained soil organic matter. CRP actually had the highest soil organic matter, and again, perennial system, growing carbon, pulling carbon from the atmosphere for a longer period of the year than in annual systems. So again, if you're in perennial systems, you probably already have good soil organic matter, and there's probably less of a fit for you for cover crops. In that same study, Perry and our colleague Anton Beckerman looked at 4-year average net returns in dollars per acre for the pea cover crop wheat system compared to the fallow wheat system at the full N rate, and found that net returns were about the same. We know pea seed is fairly expensive, and so that's pretty impressive that the net returns were about the same. At the half N rate, though, it gets a little more impressive, where the pea cover crop wheat system slightly outperformed the fallow wheat system. So again, it looks like there might be some long-term economic benefits that we're of course not going to see probably in the short term. Some take-home messages there. In the first 3 cycles of the study, wheat grain yield was not higher after the legume than after fallow. After 4 two-year cycles, wheat grain yield and protein were higher after the legume cover crop than after fallow, at least at the half N rate. Higher than normal precipitation in 2010 likely increased the release of available nitrogen from an increased organic nitrogen pool, and also made nitrogen rather than water limiting to plant growth. And we saved over 100 pounds of N per acre in that 1 year, 2010, following the legume cover. Finally, economic returns were more stable with the cover crop, meaning they were less dependent on the nitrogen. Any questions on those studies before I wrap up? Yeah.
Do you expect the organic matter concentration in your pea fowl or pea wheat to actually eventually start decreasing because of the high frequency of nitrogen? So I know that like Wayne Beck at Dakota Lakes has shown as it increases the frequency of soybeans in a rotation, it decreases the organic matter. Do you expect the same?
Yeah, so the question regarded peas, which have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, which microbes love because they're not limited by nitrogen, so they'll break that down quickly. And so some people have argued that if you have too much legume in your system, you can actually decrease your soil organic matter. I don't know what to think in the long term. Here, it looked like our cover crop system maintained soil organic matter. Possibly that would happen, but it might give some credence to choosing a cover crop that does have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. So maybe an oat-pea mix or something that will stick around a little bit longer, not get broken down so fast. Good question. Other questions? Okay, so what are some economic options? It's hard to think about waiting 8 years to see a break even with using cover crops. But another option would be grazing, which some of the subsequent speakers will be talking about. There's current work in Bozeman, at Corvallis, at MSU Northern, looking at grazing cover crops instead of just spraying them out, which is what mainly Perry and I have done. So getting almost a more immediate economic return. The grower panel will talk about that later. So in conclusion, I'd say in the short term that grain yield is generally equal or less than after fallow. following a cover crop. Early termination is really key to preventing yield and protein losses. In short-term studies, there does not appear to be yield or soil quality advantage of mixes over single species pea. In the long term, we found that yield, protein, and net revenue can be higher after cover crops than after fallow, especially at lower nitrogen rates. Cover crops appear to provide some resilience to uncontrollable factors such as weather and markets. I didn't mention, but that economic study, also we looked at both low protein discounts and high protein discounts. Net revenues were almost identical following cover crop, but were greatly different following fallow. And finally, cover crop value to soil health, subsequent crops, and possibly even land value is expected to increase over time. If you do have any additional questions, either on cover crops or soil fertility, you can go to my website. Yeah, question in the back?
What does the early termination do to the value, grazing value of that cover crop, which is in your slide?
What does early termination do to the grazing value, did you say?
Yeah, what does it do to the grazing value when you do an early termination to preserve some of the nitrogen benefit in the subsequent crop?
Yeah, so our early termination was all sprayed out, so we were not grazing it. In a grazing system, say we were to graze early to basically stop water use, I think of early forage as, and some other people can jump in, but early season forage as being high quality, with the biggest concern being high nitrate levels. So it would probably need to be tested for forage nitrate. Did that answer your question?
It does, so that leads me to conclude that there's probably not an early grazing, early termination option for grazing.
I wouldn't say that, and some of the other speakers will probably address that.